Thanks for being here today. My name is Lauren Culler, and I am research faculty of environmental studies and also at the Institute of Arctic Studies. And I have the honor of introducing our guest, Kendra Pierre-Louis, who is here with us today and for a short time tomorrow from the New York Times Climate Desk. So I also want to say that I'm one of the principal investigators here at Dartmouth on a grant from the National Science Foundation called Partnerships for Polar Science Education and Outreach in Greenland and Antarctica. And this program is set up to engage graduate students from across campus in learning how to communicate science and do good outreach. So Kendra's visit is part of that program, and she's here to meet with faculty and also graduate students to help them think about how they communicate their science. So Kendra, as I mentioned, comes to us from the New York Times climate team, where she's been since 2017. I actually first met Kendra in Greenland in 2015. She was there covering a variety of interesting things that were going on that summer. And fortunately for us, she covered some of our work, our well-known work on Arctic mosquitoes. So it was great to spend a day in the field with her. And since meeting Kendra in 2015, we've really enjoyed following her work. She completed a master's degree in science writing from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and since then has worked at Popular Science as a staff writer, and then, as I mentioned, she's been at the New York Times. Prior to getting her degree in science writing, she also has a background in sustainable development, a master's from S.I.T. Graduate Institute just down the road in Brattleboro, and she also has a bachelor's in economics from Cornell. So Kendra, we're so lucky to have you here, and we really look forward to hearing your talk. So please join me in welcoming Kendra.
So I think I should turn this off so I don't get feedback. Is it off? Okay, cool. Thanks for having me. Sorry about that. The first thing that I want to tell you is I'm a text reporter primarily, so people do not pay me to talk well or talk good, so you've been warned. So a little bit about me is, okay, good. As Lauren said, I'm a reporter on the Climate Desk with the New York Times. The Climate Desk has been around for we're in our third year, and I've been with them for about a year and a half. We have about 15 dedicated reporters, most in New York and a bunch in DC, all reporting on climate change. As Lauren mentioned, we met for the first time in Greenland, and she actually snapped that picture of me. And it's awesome because everyone thinks that's what my job actually is, but my job is mostly behind a desk. But we can pretend I'm that hardcore. And as she mentioned, I was reporting on her mosquito work, and this is a story that came out of it, why giant mosquitoes are suddenly swarming Greenland. One thing to remember, always remember, reporters don't write the headlines. So if you hate it or you love it, it's probably not my fault. So about this presentation. So the presentation, you can kind of think of it in two halves. A lot of you are from Dartmouth, and I know you guys know what climate change is. But some of you maybe are not as well versed in science, so I'm going to kind of work through that kind of quickly as sort of the backdrop of what this conversation is about. And then the second half is sort of thinking through, rewind. So for those of you who already know climate change, when you're looking at the stuff that I'm presenting, A, please don't point out my mistakes, and B, I'm kidding, and B, think through sort of how I'm presenting. So for the scientists in the audience who are very well versed in the science, this could kind of be an interesting exercise in terms of how I do it versus how you might do it. And then the other thing I want you to sort of, the other half of the presentation is sort of what goes through my head and sort of how I think about reporting on climate change and what it means to report on climate change when I'm focusing primarily on science, which is my focus. So a few quick facts about climate change. The greenhouse effect is why our planet is habitable, right? Yes? I like some feedback. Yes, cool. And there are fossil fuels are a greenhouse, and so they're naturally occurring in most cases. Did my mic die? No, you're good. Okay, sorry. They're naturally occurring in most cases, but when we burn fossil fuels, when we burn coal, when we burn natural gas, we release more into the atmosphere, and it traps even more of the heat in our planet, right? That's the bottom line of the greenhouse effect, yes? And these are some of the big ones, like nitrous oxide, and that's sort of the breakdown of where the nitrous oxide in our atmosphere goes. Carbon dioxide, which is the one that we talk about all the time. Methane, or natural gas. I feel like I was like 20 when I realized they were the same thing, that I was like cooking with this thing that was literally cooking our atmosphere. And when you put it all together, this is sort of what the greenhouse effect looks like, right? So there are these gases that trap heat in the atmosphere, just like a natural greenhouse, or just like a plant greenhouse. When we release more of these gases into the atmosphere, they hold on to more of the heat, right? So the more of these gases you were to put in like a greenhouse, the warmer it would get. That's sort of what's happening to our planet, right? So climate change is an existential threat to humanity. Its effects are already being felt. Ooh, sorry, I'm ahead of you guys. And is a topic most people would rather ignore. This is fine, right? So the question that I sort of engage with and think about a lot is, even if I'm dealing with an audience that accepts the science of climate change, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, most people don't want to hear it because they feel like it's depressing, which brings us sort of back to the title slide, which is Gloom My Beat? And that name came around, so my Twitter handle is Kendra, Gloom is my beat, Pierre-Louis. And it came about because at my last job at PopSci, I covered climate change, and my coworker who sat on the other side of the cubicle from me covered a lot of like natural or like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and those sorts of things. And so our editor called us doom and gloom. I was gloom, she was doom. And it stuck. And oftentimes when I talk about reporting on climate change or going to the world, people often ask me, how do I get through it without being depressed? And so I know that a lot of people generally don't want to click on a story that is going to bum them out before they read it, and which they feel is not going to have a hopeful end at the bottom of it. And so the question I'm constantly asking myself is, how do I get people to read a story and to listen to a message that they don't want to hear? Even if they accept the science, even if they have the values underpinning it, but that they just sort of reject on its face because they don't want to watch something or hear something that will bum them out. So the first thing that's important to know is that there are actually 6 Americas. We often talk about climate change in the United States as people either accept the science or they don't accept the science, but Yale Climate Communication, actually there's a big spectrum. From the alarmed, so these are the people that accept the science and are pretty freaked out. They're probably attending marches, and they've likely changed how they functionally live in this world, to the dismissive, and they're the ones that say, you know, it's not happening, or if it's happening, it doesn't matter. So I guess the first question I have for you guys is, how many, what do you think that range is? Like, how many people do you think are dismissive? 10%? 20%? 30%? 30%, okay. 9. Way lower than you thought it was, wasn't it, right? The problem is that most people actually don't spend a lot of time talking about climate change. It's not what you bring up at the cookout generally. And so when your annoying uncle who spends way too much time on Reddit reading conspiracy theories goes off, you just let him rattle for 15 minutes and then you change the topic, right? So when you're in that environment, most people, there's a disproportionate belief that more people support their views than actually do. In the United States, there are only 2 counties in America where the acceptance rate is below 50%. So everywhere in America, you're in the majority. Pat yourself on the back. I'm assuming you guys accept the science because you wouldn't be listening to me talk. Yeah, and every state is above 50%. So does that change sort of what you thought was happening? And so for me, that's I don't spend a lot of time thinking about trying to convince people. 1, because that's not my job as a reporter, and 2, because I don't need to do the convincing. People are already convinced. One more. So as a climate change reporter, my responsibility is to give people an accurate understanding of the scientific data, so they can better understand the world around them, right? That's just basic science communication. Correct misperceptions around the science. And there are misperceptions around climate change. even among people who accept it. A lot of people confuse it with ozone depletion, so I get a lot of emails telling me about how like climate change is giving them really bad sunburns. And these are like not, like it's just confusion. And then correlate it to their daily life, because climate change, it's not as slow as it used to be, but it's relatively invisible. We can see the effects of climate change, but we can't actually see climate changing directly, right? I mean, if you can, that'd be awesome. Let me know. And then interrogate policies. But I don't do that. I don't do number 4, not morally or anything. It's just the beat that I cover is primarily science. We have 2.5 political reporters in DC who really cover it from the politics and the policies perspective. So understanding the science. These are often study stories. So a researcher comes out with a study. There's a whole format of how I find out about them. Sometimes they give me a heads up, like Lauren did. Sometimes they're pre-releases, and so I get them a couple of days to a couple of weeks before they come out. And so I'm just calling scientists from my desk. These are desk reported, and the more warning that a researcher gives me within reason, the better. If you call me at noon and telling me that a story is going live at 2 p.m., I'm probably not going to cover it. I don't write that fast, and I can't find an outside expert to vet what the study that fast. So a good example of this kind of understanding science is this story that we did a year ago. Sorry, I've been traveling a lot, so my sense of time is compressed, and I have no idea what year we're in currently. Which is about sea level, the sea ice in the Arctic disappearing. And and there have been a lot of stories about the fact that every summer or every spring. So in general, what happens with the sea ice is it grows in winter and it shrinks in summer, right? Because it's cold in winter and hot in summer, right? We're talking about the Arctic, not the Antarctic. So every year there have been, for like the past 20 years, there have been these new reports coming out saying there's less sea ice this time of year, that the sea ice didn't grow this much, the sea ice didn't grow this much. And so this is kind of a new perspective on that same story, which is essentially that sea ice is getting younger. And what that means is younger sea ice is thinner sea ice. And that has real implications. And so I want to show you what this actually looks like live. I'm so going to get this wrong. Oh, I just have to go back one. And so what's cool is it's actually, sorry, it's actually an interactive, or it moves. It should, yeah. So you can see over time how that sea ice extent has changed, and also there's a graph further down that talks about how the youth of it, right? So that's another way of getting at what's essentially an old story, right? Like we've been hearing this narrative for a while, right? But this resonates with people. So this is one way of doing of helping people understand what's going on in our world. So I just want to, I am not completely bad at this. Cool. So another one that we did that is Arctic-based is Antarctica is melting faster than it was a decade ago. And so for that, we use really beautiful visuals. Sometimes I'm very lucky to work for a place like the New York Times. Sometimes we send people to places like Antarctica or the Arctic. My colleague is going to Greenland in a couple of weeks. Sometimes there's stock footage, but it's really trying to get people to sort of see what's happening in the world around them. And then the other thing that I talked, so these are understanding the science. This is just trying to get people to understand the process by which science is done. So there are a few sort of benchmarks, if you will, for which stories we'll report on and studies we'll report on and which ones we won't. So is it a reputable journal? Does someone who did not take part in the study but is an expert in that field vet that study for me to make sure that it's a decent study and that I'm not talking out of turn? I was going to say something naughty. Journalists have potty mouths. And then the other is to what is it? Well, we're the news, so generally it has to be novel unless it's shocking, or has it been replicated, right? So I try not to do studies that are new, are using a completely new methodology and arriving at a completely extreme result, different from a bunch of other studies. If they're using the same or similar traditional methodologies and arriving at an extreme result, that's kind of a different, or if they're using a new methodology and they're arriving at an existing result that kind of back checks it, that's kind of a different thing. The other thing that I have to do sometimes is correct misperceptions. So if it's cold, how can there be climate change? If somebody asks me that one more time, I'm moving to Antarctica. So this originally started actually from a Trump tweet, and then it became such a, I've only been at the Times for basically 2 winters at this point, and we just redid it this year and made it evergreen so that I never have to do it again. Because it's kind of a frustrating question, and also represents sort of like the idea that climate change is just it getting hotter, as opposed to my perhaps more accurate phrase, which is like global weirding. So this one is one that I did before I was at the New York Times. I did this at Popular Science. And it's what's really going on with sea level rise. And around that time, there was I don't know if it's a meme, but there was like, among certain corners of the internet, there was this narrative, I guess is a better way of phrasing it, that NASA had evidence that sea level rise wasn't actually happening anymore and it was going down. And so what they were doing is they were taking this graph, which is, this is old now, but 2017, this is NASA's graph of sea level rise over time. And anyone who's taken math knows that like graphs like this, when there's like a trend, right? So we can all agree that over time, sea level rise is rising. In a given year, it may go up, it may go down a little bit, but the overall trend is upwards, right? We're in agreement with that, right? So they were taking this graph and they were cherry picking it to look something like that. So they were zooming really in. And the errors are the same points on both graphs, same points in time on both graphs. And so that's what they were doing to convince people that NASA was just sitting and covering up this evidence that sea level rise was no longer happening and it was on the decline. And so, so I knew this was happening, and it was becoming a big enough topic that people like to email me things to prove that I'm just in it for the climate change money. So I felt like we needed to address it. And so the first thing we did was, if you look, is we didn't put climate change in the story, right? Like, if you were reading that, would you know it was a climate change story? Well, oh, wrong audience, sea level rise. But for like a normal person, it doesn't say climate change, it just says sea level rise. Even the best data can be presented in misleading ways, right? So it kind of reads more about, or I guess maybe you would know it was about climate change, but you wouldn't necessarily know where it was coming out, right? You wouldn't know if it was saying I was into what NASA was saying or I was against NASA, right? Like, I really believe this conspiracy theory about sea level rise, right? You'd have to kind of click through to get the data. And so the first paragraph in the story, and I promise I won't be reading to you all day, but it begins like this. In 1995, MacArthur Wheeler robbed 2 Pittsburgh banks without so much as a mask. Writes William Poundstone in his book, Head in the Cloud, Why Knowing Things Still Matters When Facts Are So Easy to Look Up. Wheeler, you see, believed that a coating of lemon juice he'd rubbed onto his face would make him invisible to the bank's security cameras. Shockingly, it didn't. A local television show broadcast the footage, a tip came in, and cops appeared at Wheeler's door. But I wore the juice, he said. So, right, so that was actually the beginning of it. I don't talk about climate change, I don't talk about sea level rise. From there, I transitioned to how, we all sort of have our biases, we all have our hidden perceptions, and how cherry-picked data can fit into those perceptions. And I included that graph, but between you and me, I don't look at graphs most of the time. So even though I included it, in the text, I described it. Try to think about, and I described it this way. Try to think of it the way you'd think about weight gain. If you hopped on the scale after putting on 40 pounds in a year and noticed you were 3 pounds lighter than the month before, you'd be foolish to conclude that your weight was on the decline. You need to see sustained weight loss over time to make that judgment. After all, the human body can lose 3 pounds after a good poop. And so about a month after I wrote this story on Twitter, someone reached out to me and they were like, hey, I shared your story with a climate denying family member, and they now accept that sea level rise is happening and that climate change is real. And they were like, it was a poop analogy that did it. And I've never been prouder. And so the other thing that I try to do and that I think about a lot is how do I connect it to someone's daily life, not using poop emojis. So how many of you in this room were born after 1976? Congratulations, you've never experienced a normal temperature year. And so a lot of you in this room probably know that, but most people don't, and it freaks people out. And one guy emailed me, he must have been really, I tweeted this out, and he was like, even the Pinatubo year, the big year, the volcano. And I was like, yeah, even the Pinatubo year. It went down, you can look at it in the graph, but it went down that year, but not as much as it had been before. So that's just one way of sort of reframing and reshaping how people are taking in that data. This one is the world's best art director. She commissioned this art. It's a study that says that essentially we kind of get accustomed to warmer than usual temperatures. So if we have a number of warmer than usual temperatures, we mentally adjust and we now create that as normal. Why does California have so many wildfires? I did this last year at the tail end of the big Woolsey and Camp fires. And it was like, on the climate beat, you kind of hate natural disasters because you don't leave your desk, or natural hazards, you don't leave your desk, because this is the one time where people are actually paying attention and where you can start talking about the linkages between extreme weather events broadly. So we're always really careful to not say that climate change caused this fire. But we do say that, and this is accurate, that climate change is creating conditions that make fires like the ones that happened last year more likely. And that's just one way of doing it because people are actually paying attention. This is the same thing. Like if you live out west, like this matters to you. And then one more. We did a video during hurricane season, which I won't show you because I don't like looking at myself. But it was like, it was the same thing. It's like a lot of people right now are paying attention to hurricanes. This is a good opportunity to talk about climate change. I have a lot of these. More floods, more droughts. It's happening again right now in the Midwest, right? And we're not making those connections, and it's really important as a reporter, these are the opportunities where I can leverage because people are paying attention to make those connections. And sometimes I'm actually working on a hurricane story right now that I held. The studies came out in the fall, and I was like, it's not worth doing it now because no one's paying attention. Hurricane season is over. So I actually held them back to do them June 1, to release them when the next hurricane happens because we know they're going to happen. And this is also connecting it to people, but like there was that really wonky 1.5 degree UN study that unless you're really a climate scientist, you're never going to read, and you're not going to necessarily it's not going to be comprehensible to your average person. But so we do things like this, where we convert into things. It's the same data, but it's just in a way that makes sense to regular people. And oftentimes we'll strip out some of that nuance because we have to. That nuance is really important to scientists, and it's really important to research, but it's not necessarily that important to a regular person who's reading about climate change in between picking up their kid at school and buying groceries. On the same trend. So now we're bringing it to like, okay, so this is what I do. The question is, how do I do it? I cry a lot. So I communicate scientific information, which is the what. Like, what is it? And then I also try to find a hook. So like, why does it matter? And then I try to connect it to people. So this is my favorite example, mostly because I'd been wanting to write about dirt for a really long time. And I like writing about things that a lot of people think are boring. And so I'm always trying to find ways to make them more interesting. And so this study came out, Current and Historical Land Use Influences Soil-Based Ecosystem Services in an Urban Environment. Now, because this is perhaps the nerdiest room I've ever talked to, you guys maybe know this study. And you also understand what it means. But what I turned it into was this. A superpower in your own backyard. And because it was the year Black Panther came out, we opened it up with a reference to Wakanda and vibranium. I have really, really lovely editors who are very tolerant of me. So communicating scientific information, I don't write anthropogenic climate change. The first time actually an editor, a professor wrote that in my paper, I was like, he wrote ACC. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he was a science writer. He should have known better. I use human-caused global warming or human-caused climate change. Anthropogenic is a really wonky word in terms of finding a hook. So that earlier piece, it was Wakanda. And in this piece, which is about the fact that because of climate change, the Arctic is getting warmer, beavers are moving to the Arctic. So remember what I said? We don't write the headlines. So I know some of you guys are pretty pro-beaver. I've gotten some beaver hate mail for that title. Because they're just reforming their image, and people are starting to realize how vital beavers are to the ecosystem, and they think that I'm slandering them and bringing the rhetoric back. But again, didn't write the title. And so the issue with this story is that essentially because the climate is getting warmer, the tree line is moving up, so where trees can be is moving further north, and beavers are moving further north too, and there's anecdotal evidence that other animals are moving further north as well. This is like North America Arctic, so like US, Canada. But not a lot of people live in the Arctic, and so it's really hard to get conclusive evidence that they're actually doing this, right? But beavers are special because beavers make dams, and dams you can see from space. So this guy used satellite footage and high-res, high-altitude footage to look for beaver dams over time. And the other problem with beaver dams, though, is they trap warm water on the land, right? So when they do that, they thaw the permafrost. And so that's the real problem with them heading into the Arctic, is they're hastening the speed of permafrost thaw. And so that's super wonky. And I had to figure out, I think this piece was 700 or 800 words. So I had to figure out how to say all of that in that amount of words, like convey that and all the nuances of the study. And so what I said was that the problem isn't just that they're moving into a new environment, it's that they're gentrifying it. Which is what they're doing, right? So finding a hook is really important. And this was one that I came up with, but I love it when researchers, you can come up with this too. You can come up with these really cool analogies that make it, and then it's an analogy that you've approved, right? And that one, so you have to worry less about a slightly off-kilter climate reporter coming up with a wacky one. Ones that researchers have given me, sugar maples are something of a Goldilocks tree. There are more pieces of plastic in the ocean than stars in the Milky Way, which apparently I don't know how to spell. The other thing with finding a hook is sometimes it can be a story about how the science came about. So I did this story that's not in this presentation, but I did a story also in the Arctic about how wildlands are getting noisier. So basically we're putting up more like just stuff, airplanes and just things in places that were quieter. And I talked to the main researcher on this study, and then I was interviewing this outside expert. It was this guy up in Cornell, and he told me this amazing story of going up into the Arctic and like asking an Inupiaq elder for whale ears because they do traditional whale hunting, and he wanted this is in the 1970s, he wanted the whale ears for a colleague who was studying how whales navigate their environment with sound. And so he'd had this like massive recorder, and he brought it up into the Arctic, and he played it for this whaling captain to like have him understand the work that he was trying to do. And the whaling captain was like, "Sure, you can have the whale ears." And they went out of his camping hut and to part ways. Like he was going back on his boat to go back to the lower 48, and this Inuit captain was going, I guess, home. And the captain like beckoned him over, and he said, he didn't actually say anything, he didn't speak English. So he beckoned him over, and well, first he took his kayak paddle, and he put it one half in a hole in the ice in the water, and put it to his jawbone. And then he beckoned this researcher over, and he told him essentially, like, he mimicked, like, you do the same. So he was like, okay. And he did it, and he could hear the whale song. And that ended up being the opening of this story because it was such a compelling story. Another one that I did this year this year, was this about the sea star wasting disease that has hit like the west coast of the United States. The researcher on that, she told me this really delightful, so the wasting disease sort of took everyone by surprise. And so there was this mass die-off of sea stars, but nobody had any money to actually study this mass die-off. And so this researcher told this story about how she'd been sounding the alarm and telling people this was happening and it was a problem. And she'd gotten, I guess, some kind of media attention. And one day she opens up her mail, and there's a check in it. It's for $400. A group of school children in Arkansas had heard about the sea stars dying, and they couldn't tolerate it. And so they'd launched a fundraiser to raise money to help her research saving sea stars. It makes you want to cry, right? How you came about your science, to me as a reporter, is just as important as the science itself, because that's one way of getting that story across. It's one way of getting people to care. This one is polar bears. Some researchers put a video camera on a polar bear, and people love polar bears. So this was like really easy. I should have pulled that one up because the video was really delightful. But that's just kind of an easy sell. This one was sort of a similar thing. This one was not a study story. It was a little bit more detailed. Because it's getting warmer, bears aren't hibernating the way they're supposed to, and they're getting into more conflicts with humans. It's like a really big problem, especially out west. And my, again, best art director. It's just a little, like, you don't feel like you're about to read this really depressing story and it kind of is. Like, in it, I talk about, like, finding a bear with, like, hundreds of ketchup packets in its stomach, and that's what killed it. Like, it's not all whimsy, but that at least sets you up for some hope that there will be some joy and some levity in this story. And I really, really try whenever possible, like that beaver story, to make it funny if people aren't dying, right? Because, like, it's not funny when people die. Another one is this Olympic story did really well, and I'm going to actually pull it up because it's an interactive. I don't want to out myself, but I don't really care about the Olympics. But a lot of people do. And what this one toggles back and forth is it's saying that, like, and we did it in time for the Winter Olympics, so it was timed with the Korea Olympics last year. And it was essentially saying that, like, many of the Olympic locations are increasingly becoming too warm to actually hold Winter Olympics in the future. And that just kind of gets you in the gut, right? Especially if you love the Winter Olympics, and a lot of the Winter Olympic sports can't be brought indoors. And so that picture at the top is from Sochi, which was an iffy location anyway. But that's cross-country skiing. You can't really bring cross-country skiing inside. And so as a companion piece of that, we actually interviewed an American cross-country skier, Jessie Diggins, who's also a climate activist, and she talks pretty openly about how, like, the fact that cross-country skiing has traditionally been a relatively cheap sport for people to get into, and it's something she grew up doing, and she ended up being really good at it, and, you know. And so, like, how she now has the money and the resources to travel to snow, but that the next generation of skiers, you can't travel to Italy to go skiing when you're 9. I mean, maybe you can, but most people can't. And so that's her really big concern. And that did really, really well because it's personifying this thing that a lot of people actually care about. And then at, like, a month after I talked to her, she became the first American to win a gold medal in cross-country skiing, which I think is completely because of me. But that's another way of connecting with people. I don't care about cross-country skiing or the Winter Olympics, but people do. And so I'm going to write about it. Sorry, not too much longer. And then a couple more. So last year, there was a tornado, and there had been a few in New York and in Massachusetts. And I was like, is this climate change? And what I discovered is nobody knows. Uh, and so, like, actually being honest about the uncertainty, I think makes it more truthful and also humanizes scientists and reinforces the fact that science is a process. And the fact that I was allowed to write a story about the reasons why we don't know if these tornadoes are actually in keeping with climate change because of the limitations of the tornado data that we actually have, again, I think contributes to that idea of science as a process. It's also okay to be a little weird. I did a story on how California's urchins are being eaten by the cockroaches of the sea. I had done research on it for like 10 months. I kept calling it my kelp story. Everyone at work was sick of hearing about my kelp story. And I was fairly certain that it was only going to be me and my best friends who I harassed into reading it who were going to read this kelp story. And it wasn't me. It did bananas. It did really good traffic. A lot of people read it. It really resonated with people because kelp forests for a lot of people are an ecosystem they didn't know existed. And kelp forests are pretty much everywhere except for Antarctica. And so a lot of people recognized that that ecosystem was like in their backyard and that they were at risk of losing it. But if you remember only one thing from my talk, it's the power of a poop emoji. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have time for questions, and we ask anyone asking a question to please use a microphone.
Thanks, Kendra. I was curious whether you see any trends in like the acceptance of talking about uncertainty in scientific research in reporting in general.
So as Lauren mentioned, I actually haven't been a full-time journalist for that long, so only like 3 years. And I think that's too young for me to know if there are trends. I try as hard as I can, and sometimes I have fights over it. Because I think people really like certainty more than, science is a process. And so, and this isn't like a Times issue or a media issue, but I think in general, when people are pushed against, right? So like there's been this tension in this country for quite some time about whether climate change is real. And I think when people are like so frustrated, they feel pushed into this corner where they have to be absolutist. And I think just because of the nature and the timing of when I came up, and also the first place I ever worked for, like as a fully working journalist, was Inside Climate News, and they formed in like I think 2007, and their opinion was climate change is real, we accept the science, and we're just going to operate from that assumption, and that's kind of how I've operated my entire career. As short as it's been, but I haven't really seen it. I also do feel like that uncertainty tends to get stripped because if you're not someone who reads a lot of scientific journals or hang out a lot with scientists, you don't understand the importance of that uncertainty. And there's a tension around, as I hinted, around word count and length. And so that can often, like hedge words and things often feel like that's the thing that can get stripped.
Hi, Kendra.
Hi.
I actually met you in 2015 in Greenland as well. I was with Lauren, so it's nice to see you again. And I've been following you on Twitter, and you're quite funny.
Oh, thanks.
I guess one question I have for you is there's been a lot of conversation among the scientific community about how do you study climate change and travel all the time on airplanes, emitting countless amounts of CO2 to go to conferences and study sites. Is there a conversation like that also happening on kind of the journalism, science communication side of like, can you offset like what you are contributing to climate change in the sake of covering climate change?
So I can't speak about science communication generally, but I can talk about like climate change at my desk, and we definitely have those conversations a lot. We know about the limitations of offsets. And we also know that airplane travel is like the hardest to decarbonize. I was telling Lauren that there was I actually just got off a bunch of travel recently, but I'd gone like from November to like March without setting foot on a plane. And that felt like I was like very proud of that stretch. One of the things that I think about a lot is the limits of individual actions. And so I kind of try to separate what I do for work with what I do recreationally. And recreationally, I'm trying to fly less, if you will. And I'm not like hopping on a plane for work for any reason, also just because it's exhausting. But like there are just places that you have to do and that you have to go. And one of the biggest criticisms of journalism, especially national journalism, is that we don't even know the communities that we're talking about. So it gets even, if I'm reporting on a community and I haven't even seen it, there's a lot of extra tension built into it, and there are a lot of, I just was in Duluth, and I talked to all of these people before I went. It was a story about Duluth as a climate refuge city. And it wasn't until I showed up that I knew that there was a Native American reservation, literally next to Duluth, and I hadn't talked to a single Native American. And that's a problem. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't gone to Duluth. So I don't have a good answer, except that we are having that same conversation. I don't have a solution. But if anyone does. I didn't fly here.
I'm definitely not an undergraduate, as you can see here, but maybe some of the students here could be interested in how you had gotten into your experience at Cornell, getting into the MIT science writing program, and so forth. Did you do a lot of writing in Cornell, for example?
No. I took 3 writing courses. 2 were required while I was at Cornell. I was an economics major, and I was an economics major. I probably shouldn't admit this, but I do. I was an economics major because it had the fewest required courses. And so it would freed me up to take other things that I wanted to take. And so I graduated during the first recession that nobody remembers because of the 2007-8 recession. And then I was working a bunch of I don't want to call them odd jobs, but I had a bunch of jobs, and I was working at one, and I wouldn't shut up about environmental stuff, and my coworker said, you should maybe go do that. And so I went and got a graduate degree in sustainable development, and then the economy crashed. and then I got a job eventually, it took a while, I got jobs in sustainable development, but I realized I was spending a lot of time writing. I ended up writing a book, and I had no free time because I was doing all of this freelance writing. And finally I was like, if I actually just made writing my job, I could have free time, which is a lie. But at least now I only have one job.
Mike's not on.
Oh. Okay. Hello?
No.
Green light, though.
I'm gonna pass the one on the other side down. Pass that back.
Hello, so again, I'm an undergrad here at Dartmouth, and I'm quite passionate of writing, and I'm actually thinking I might like to have something to do with journalism. Then I also like science a lot, so I came to your talk because I thought, wow, this is someone I really would love to hear from. I'm just wondering what I can do to try this out somehow without being required to, be a reporter for the New York Times, because I cannot do that just yet.
Yeah, I didn't try. I didn't start. I graduated. So I went to MIT to study science writing, and I graduated with the goal of first time I graduated without a recession. Anyway, my goal was to just make enough money to survive. Journalism isn't exactly marketed as the most lucrative profession. To answer your question, for someone, National Association of Science Writers is a really good place to start. They have a student membership, and they have an annual conference that's really awesome. And then there's a book called the Science Writers Handbook. And those are kind of the 2 best sort of basic introductory resources for you to check out. And then there's also a website called the Open Notebook, but that can get a little, you should check it out either way, and you can decide if that's at the level that you're at.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you reconcile sort of ambiguous, if not clickbaity titles, sort of the trade-off of getting more traffic versus having people who do sort of headline news getting the wrong takeaway.
So the third slide was reporters don't write their own headlines. That was especially true at PopSci, or that's especially true at the Times. At PopSci, I'm a terrible headline writer. So at PopSci, I wrote headlines, but they always got changed. I like to think that we at least try to avoid inaccuracies in our headlines, even if they go for like extrapolation. I'm not judged or evaluated based on clicks, and I don't even know. Like I have a basically the way the time system works is. I have a loose idea when a story is doing well, just because of a few things that happen on the back end. Like I get alerts, but I don't know if a story like that urchin story was like, oh, did really well. Like part of how I know it does really well is like the number of retweets I get on Twitter when I tweet something, or the number of hate emails I get. But I couldn't tell you if like doing well is 100,000 or a million. Like I have no idea. That is all above my pay grade, so I don't have to reconcile that ever. And I really appreciate the fact that I can sort of exist blissfully ignorant of like story performance.
Hi, just a quick question. Do you ever find it difficult maybe to balance incorporating like comedy and humor into your pieces and maintaining scientific integrity? Like, is that ever something difficult, like attracting the readers for like boring material?
Yeah, sometimes I mean, so I'm fun, or I try to be funny. I don't know how successful I am, both because I think it's useful just for readers, but also because it's useful for me. Like it's fun to be funny. But ultimately, like the science always is like. Nothing is worse than sending a story to a scientist and having them be like, you got it wrong. So I'm always going for accuracy over like humor. I don't write something and say, oh, well, who cares if it's inaccurate, it's funny. I have a weird writing process anyway. I talk about it like hearing voices in my head. When it's some of my stories, you can tell what songs are stuck in my head because like the cadence of the sentence structure are actually song lyrics. I'm not always the most pleasant person to be around when I'm writing. I get real strange. So like it's hard. Like what comes out, and then you go back and you edit like good. And I feel like that doesn't get stressed enough. Is that like nothing I write is in a vacuum. It's always edited, and at the times it's pretty heavily edited, just because we're an edit-heavy desk. I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry, that was kind of rambly.
Hello, it's a very great talk. I'm just curious about how journalists or New York Times as a whole decide which topic to follow to report, because there are so many cool studies happening every day in science technology. So, but the space for the newspaper is pretty limited. So, do journalists actively hunt for stories, or is the other? Yeah, how this work?
So some stories are only on print or are only on the web. Some stories don't make it into the print. There's often a gap between, especially with science stories, because just the nature of science stories, there can be a gap between when the study is released and it goes live on the web and it gets printed in the paper. So like a lot of science stories get, I think Tuesday, I don't know, I don't read the print paper. There's like a day where a lot of the science stories get published, and so if your study comes out outside of that day, it'll still go live on the website, but it'll eventually end up in the paper. In terms of answering your question, like how do we select, it's a mixed bag. So like if a study came out that was like the world is going to end in 3 days, obviously no brainer, you're doing that story, right? Some of it's just interest. I don't particularly love coral reef stories right now, and so for me to do a coral reef story, it would have to be a pretty high bar. It would have to be a pretty fascinating coral reef story, and I don't like it partly because I feel like we've done them a lot. I don't like them because a lot of people don't live in the tropics, and so it doesn't resonate with a lot of readers. And I'm just like, I don't know, my interests lie elsewhere right now. So there is like the interest of the reporter. you can sort of see that thread. Like if you start following reporters, metaphorically, not literally, you sort of start seeing the things that kind of like they're really interested in. So like Henry Fountain on our desk, he's really into earthquakes in Alaska and geology. And so a lot of his stories kind of reflect that. I'm still a little bit more of a gadfly, so I don't quite have that down yet. But like, yeah, so it's a mix of like, how important is this just like to society, and what do the implications mean to society, and then also the interests of the reader, and then sometimes, or the writer, and then sometimes it's like, oh well, our readers will be really interested in this, you know. So it's a mixed bag, but like, we don't do a story just because people will click on it.
Hi, I'm a graduate student in the earth sciences, and I just have a follow-up question on something you said in response to an earlier question. But in terms of meeting some of the communities that you're writing about, like outside the States, in the Arctic, for example, do you send the stories to them, or do you have follow-up with the communities that you work with?
So I have never written about the Arctic since I've been at the Times. That's like Henry's domain. But I did a story, one of the stories that I did when I was in Greenland was about Arctic, Greenlandic kayaking. I went to the Greenlandic Kayak Festival, and there's internet in Greenland. So I just sent it to them, to the ones that speak English anyway, and some people translated it to like other people. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just respectful to write about people and not let them know that they've been written about. So I always try and write, you know. I wrote one recently about Canada, and I mailed them the story.
Hi, thanks for the talk, and I'm just wondering why it was so cold this winter. Have you noticed, given the Times multimedia platform, a movement towards videography, radio, and television programs, which at times seems to be developing into, and will that help communicate the fields that you're interested in?
So video is its own beast. We have a video team, and when I went to Duluth, I worked with them on that, and they did that hurricane thing that I like didn't want to show you. So like we do work with them, and they're really great. We have our own graphics editor, so that Olympic story, those charts, I worked with Nadia, our graphics person, on that. But the one where it was the Arctic, the sea ice one, that was with the actual graphics team. I think that was Jeremy. So like, yeah, I think that's really helpful. It's hard to explain the Times. So the TV and I have had conversations, like Coral, who does our politics desk, she's been on The Daily a few times. And we have conversations with them about stuff that's going on and whether it sort of fits in within the niche that they're doing. It's almost like a media empire within itself. So like they are all independently, I don't want to say owned, but like operated. And so it's still the same idea of like you're essentially pitching your story to another desk or another entity to get them to work with it for things like video and radio and audio or podcasting.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. So your title was, Is Doom Your Beat?
Is Gloom.
Is Gloom Your Beat? And in climate communication, we're often warned against like presenting doomsday scenarios or worst case scenario. And I'm just curious if you think about that and like how you balance kind of like the worst case scenario and like this hopeful scenario in your pieces.
Yeah, so I get asked the hope question a lot, and I don't think it's my responsibility to give anyone hope, and I also don't think it's my responsibility to have hope, which is maybe the gloomiest thing I've ever said. But like, so this is just my personal like perspective, which is there's like doing the right thing or doing the thing that like, you know, prevents humans from mass extinction, I guess. And then there's not, right? So like, but if we don't do the right thing, if we don't at least attempt to do the right thing, we're sort of guaranteed to go down this other path. And so does that mean that you don't attempt to do it unless you're certain of the outcome? Like you get into weird like logic about like, oh, I'm only going to do this if we're definitely going to like prevent the worst effects of climate change, but we can't know we're going to prevent the worst effects of climate change until we start doing things that allow us to mitigate the effects of climate change. So it's like a chicken-egg situation. And so for me personally, I feel like the hope conversation is what people need, some people want or need to use as a driver. and that's just not how I'm wired, so I don't really think about it.
Thanks for coming. I was curious, since you really focus on reporting the science and global climate change is global, or global weirding. I really like that phrase. What sort of challenges you've run into geopolitically, since it is global and a lot of countries have articulated a policy, or is the universality of science allow you to kind of cross over geopolitics and avoid policies that governments are trying to apply to climate?
So this is silos. I actually don't do a lot of international reporting. Our desk person, we have someone on our desk who does a lot of international stuff, and so she'd be a better answer to that question. I can say though that I can own it. So in between grad school and starting at PopSci, I did a reporting trip to India and Myanmar. And in India, I found a really hard time talking to the scientists because they thought I only wanted to, the structure of Indian media is very different, and so they didn't really understand what I was asking for. And so I found this study that was really important, and I emailed the lead author and was like, hey, I'm gonna be in Delhi. Can I talk to you? And he kicked it up the chain, he kept it up the chain, and then nobody was really getting back to me, so finally I ended up in Delhi, and I was like, hey, I'm in Delhi, can you talk to me now? And I and I ended up at this government building with tea in front of me and 5 men, including the head of their group, and they were all like, we can only talk about the science, we can't talk about the political implications. And I was like, I don't even know the political implications of India. So so I'm not trying to get you to I'm not trying to get to something about some politics. I really just want to know about the monsoon. So that was one. And then in Myanmar, you couldn't get a journalism visa, or it's really hard to get a journalism visa when you're in Myanmar. And so I just didn't. And then when people asked me for my papers, I just played dumb. Yeah, there's that. And then actually 6 months after I left Myanmar, my fixer, so do you guys know what a fixer is? So when you're a journalist and you go to a foreign country, you don't know the country, right? So you get a person, often another journalist, a local journalist, who acts as your fixer, and they will either set you up with people to talk to, or they will find you a translator. They sort of help you navigate through the country closer to how a local does. Anyway, my fixer got arrested, and imprisoned for 6 months for flying a drone over the Capitol. I don't know if that's actually answering your question, but yeah, so I don't do a lot of the geopolitical stuff, but the how do you navigate as a journalist? So there is, different countries have different levels of journalistic openness. When I went to India, I absolutely had to have a journalism visa because they were arresting people for doing journalism. They just arrested a vice team.
Hi, Kendra. Thanks again for speaking. I was wondering what volume of mail you reply to when you get these big hate or perhaps congratulatory emails, and perhaps if students send you questions after lectures.
I get a lot of email, 100 to 150 email messages a day. I don't respond to negative mail ever, but I save all of it just for safety purposes. Well, I save all of the electronic ones. The print ones I'll sometimes just take a snapshot and email myself them, but I don't. We have small desks. The other mail, it really depends. I just get and I'm really not on top of my inbox right now. I get a lot, so I try and respond, and I try to be a nice human, but I'm also human, and I like things like sleep and family and friends. Oh, sorry, that's my alarm. It's telling me to leave work, actually. And then, sorry, and then I snooze it and don't leave for another 90 minutes. Yeah, I guess it's a sign of a problem where I have an alarm clock set to tell me to go home.
I'm interested in this idea of the fixer and someone to kind of help you navigate the world of journalism when you're traveling, but just navigating the world of science journalism when you cover so many different stories and have to interact with so many different scientists. Mm-hmm. What is your process for finding people, and what are the ways that we as scientists can make your job easier?
So, how do I find people? Twitter. That sounds like a joke, but there is a thing called Science Twitter, and I follow a lot of scientists, so I definitely am aware, like the scientists who tweet out their work or that tweet out their, not just their work, but like thematically, topic-wise, are definitely the ones that I'm aware of. I'm also like a Black woman, so making sure that I'm inclusive of voices of women, of people of color, is like a really important thing for me. So I'm always thinking about like if I'm covering a story and it's a male lead, I'm really trying hard to find a woman as an outside expert. So especially if you're a woman scientist, or even if you're a man scientist, and I email you, and especially if you're a woman scientist and I email you, and I say, hey, can you talk about this paper? If you can't, please just recommend another woman. The frequency with which I then get like 9 new men when I was like, I kind of really wanted a woman is pretty high. And if you're a dude, don't just recommend other dudes, recommend other women, recommend people of color. Like that's really important. I use Google Scholar a lot to find the same thematic topic. I'll look at, I don't know if other people do this, but like when a study comes up, I'll look at like the footnotes and see like the literature that they're referencing, and then see some of those studies and try and find those reporters. I'm really trying to find subject matter experts, and I'm not just looking for like a name. So I think my source list is a lot bigger than a lot of people. And also people who answer their email or pick up their phones. Like I know you guys are often not at your desks, which is why I often email you first, but honestly, like there are times where I'm on a 4-hour deadline or a 3-hour deadline or like a 0-hour deadline where they're just like, this needs to get done. And so it's whoever answers their phone the fastest.